Don't compare yourself with other people, compare yourself with who you were yesterday. The idea that women were oppressed throughout history is an appalling theory. Jordan Bernt Peterson is a Canadian psychologist, author, and media commentator. He began to receive widespread attention in the late 2010s for his views on cultural and political issues, often described as conservative. Peterson has described himself as a classic British liberal and a traditionalist. It's in responsibility that most people find the meaning that sustains them through life. It's not in happiness. It's not an impulsive pleasure. There's a personality trait known as agreeableness. Agreeable people are compassionate and polite. And agreeable people get paid less than disagreeable people for the same job. Women are more agreeable than men. If you don't stand your ground, then all that happens is, people push you backwards. It is more difficult to rule yourself than to rule a city. I don't tell people, you're okay the way that you are. That's not the right story. The right story is, you're way less than you could be. Happiness is a pointless goal. Abortion is clearly wrong. No one gets away with anything, ever, so take responsibility for your own life. Accept the terrible responsibility of life, with eyes wide open. The truth is something that burns. It burns off dead wood. And people don't like having the dead wood burnt off, often because they're 95% dead wood. Music has an intrinsic meaning, which has always been mysterious to me. Don't be dependent, at all, ever, period. Women deeply want men who are competent and powerful. And I don't mean power in that they can exert tyrannical control over others. That's not power. That's just corruption. Don't lie about anything, ever. Lying leads to hell. Free speech is not just another value. It's the foundation of Western civilization. If you're talking to a man who wouldn't fight with you, under any circumstances whatsoever, then you're talking to someone for whom you have absolutely no respect. Power is competence. Life is very difficult. One of the most ancient of religious ideas that emerges everywhere, would say, is that life is essentially suffering. If you learn a martial art, you learn to be dangerous, but simultaneously, you learn to control it. The people who hold that our culture is an oppressive patriarchy, they don't want to admit that the current hierarchy might be predicated on competence. To master a new technology, you have to play with it. It's very hard to find your own words, and you don't actually exist until you have your own words. Life is tragic. You are tiny and flawed and ignorant and weak, and everything else is huge, complex, and overwhelming. You can't have a value structure without a hierarchy. They're the same thing, because a value structure means one thing takes precedence over another. When you start to realize how much of what you've constructed of yourself is based on deception and lies, that is a horrifying realization. It makes sense that a witch lives in a swamp. The masculine spirit is under assault. It's obvious. You can't go backward in life. Become aware of your own insufficiency. I've studied authoritarianism for a very long time, for 40 years, and they're started by people's attempts to control the ideological and linguistic territory. If you're not going to be rewarded for your virtues, and instead you're going to be punished for them, then what's your motivation to continue? You should do what other people do, unless you have a very good reason not to. Assuming if there's such a thing as reality, if you have a false relationship with it, how can you do anything but fail? If you're a social scientist worth your salt, you never do a univariate analysis. One of the things I've told men over and over and over and over is if you're being rejected by all the women that you approach, it's not the women. I am not going to be a mouthpiece for language that I detest. It's not just human nature to associate in tribes. It's deeper than that. Once someone has spent enough time cultivating bad habits and biding their time, they are much diminished. Much of what they could have been has dissipated. Men and women aren't the same. And they won't be the same. That doesn't mean that they can't be treated fairly. I happen to be a big fan of Western civilization. I think it beats the hell out of tyranny and starvation. We have to rediscover the eternal values and then live them out. It's very difficult to regulate yourself, and if you learn to do that, well, it starts to spill over. I'm interested in what motivates individuals to participate in atrocious acts to support their ideological identification. I'm a practical person. I'm not too bad a carpenter. I can renovate houses. People have this capacity within them to set the world straight. People have been fed this diet of pabulum, rights, and impulsive freedom. There's just an absolute starvation for the other side of the story. You have to listen very carefully and tell the truth if you are going to get a paranoid person to open up to you. All things considered, there's nobody better for children than parents. There's no doubt that inequality destabilizes societies. I think the social science evidence on that front is crystal clear. I like to recede away from classifications. You might say that indicates a fundamental lack of commitment. I suppose that's true to some degree. It's not proper for the government to intrude too thoroughly into the domain of the family. It's inappropriate. Everything isn't political. I think Canadians are more interested in international events than Americans, because it is such a small country, so politics affect it more. If the standard transsexual person wants to be regarded as he or she, my sense is, I'll address you according to the part that you appear to be playing. The right-wingers don't want to admit that, for some people, there are no jobs. They think that conscientiousness in and of itself will do the trick. The narrow bandwidth of TV has made us think that we are stupider than we are. My publication record puts me in the top 0.5% of psychologists. The connection between psychology, mythology, and literature is as important as the connection between psychology and biology and the hard sciences. I don't really regard myself as a political figure. I like working-class people, generally speaking. It's a small percentage of people who do the 80-hour-a-week, high-powered career thing, and they're almost all men. Why? Well, men are driven by socioeconomic status, more than women. The literature, associating inequality with social instability and poor health outcomes, is pretty convincing. I've 20,000 hours of clinical practice. You're not naive after the first few thousand. I've helped people deal with things that most people can't imagine. In the West, we have been withdrawing from our tradition, religion, and even nation-centered cultures. I do believe that there are places where the mythological and the literal touch. I'm always surprised when people respond positively to what I am saying, given its seriousness and strange nature. Obviously, I'm no fan of the radical left. The multiplication force of technology on cognitive differences is massive. Whether or not I like a piece of data has very little bearing on whether or not I am likely to accept it.